All right, class, let's get started with the endocrine system. As we look at the endocrine system, this is the body system that's primarily involved with moving hormones around, or the hormone regulation system. Now, this body system has many different glands that have many different functions. There's lots of twofers in this system, where this organ is part of the endocrine system and maybe part of the digestive system, or part of the endocrine system and part of the urinary system. So a lot of these glands will serve multiple purposes in multiple body systems. A key characteristic, though, of the endocrine system is that we are going to have hormones, aka chemical messengers, and they are going to be secreted into our bloodstream. Our endocrine system releases these signals into the bloodstream. We have an exocrine system, and the secretions from the exocrine system eventually leave our bodies. So you could think of it, the exocrine system, as things that are secretions like sweat, saliva, digestive enzymes, mucus. Those are secretions that leave the body. But let's keep the current scheme. Those secretions that go into the bloodstream are going to be part of the endocrine system. A general trend with the endocrine system is that it conveys information from one part of the body to another part of the body slowly. What body system communicates information very quickly? It usually will use electrical signals to communicate the information. So what body system relies on electricity or action potentials to communicate information? Our nervous system. Well done, Angel. So the nervous system is going to have that quick response. Our endocrine system is for the slow response. And we need both to have our body functioning properly. To summarize the major glands and organs of the endocrine system, we have the hypothalamus, and directly beneath the hypothalamus we have that pituitary gland, which are both part of the diencephalon in the central nervous system. Also part of the diencephalon is the pineal gland, which is colored blue on this figure. As we move inferior, move down the human body, wrapped around the trachea, directly inferior to the larynx, we have the thyroid gland. And as we continue to move down the trachea, wrapped around the trachea, where it branches to the primary bronchi, the left and right primary bronchi, directly anterior to the, or directly by the heart, we have the thymus. Don't show that message again. We also have the adrenal glands, which are a twofer. It's the adrenal cortex and the adrenal medulla that make up the adrenal gland that is superior to the kidneys. We have the pancreas, which is directly inferior to the stomach. And then in males, we have the testicles. And in females, we have gonads. So those are the primary glands of the endocrine system that we're going to talk about tonight. Regardless of the gland, all endocrine glands are going to secrete those hormones, and each specific hormone will go to and bind to a specific target cell. Target cells are going to have receptors on their surface that have specific shapes that allow them to bind to the specific hormone. So here we can have our specific hormone, and our specific hormone in this situation kind of has a big dimple sticking out of it. The target cell has receptors that are complementary to the big dimple of the hormone. Non-target cells, cells that do not respond to that hormone, do not have receptors that can bind to that hormone. So we have a triangle-shaped receptor that doesn't bind to the dimple-shaped hormone. There are many different diseases of the human body that are related to cells either having too many receptors, or inappropriate cell types having inappropriate receptors, or a cell type not having the appropriate receptor. The one that I personally find the most interesting is androgen insensitivity hormone syndrome. Individuals that have androgen insensitivity syndrome are genetically male. They have XY chromosomes, but they don't have the ability to respond to any testosterone in their bodies. And because they weren't able to respond to testosterone while they were in utero and when they started puberty, they develop as a female and externally, and it's typically not until they start to want to have children, or they notice the fact that they don't have a menstrual cycle, that they realize that, oh, something's not right here. So we talked about endocrine glands. They secrete their products into the bloodstream. Exocrine glands are going to secrete their products either onto the surface of the body or into a tube that exits the body. So we can have the respiratory tract or the digestive tract. The theme for the exocrine secretions is that they eventually will make it outside of the body. Sometimes it takes a couple days, maybe a day or two, to work its way outside of the body. Any questions about exo versus endocrine glands? Alrighty. So let's talk about hormones in general. Generally speaking, a hormone is just a chemical messenger, a chemical signal that can travel through the bloodstream. Sometimes it doesn't have to travel very far. Sometimes it can go within an organ, and an organ can secrete a hormone that acts on itself. A good example of that is the interstitial cells of the testicles secreting testosterone, and then that testosterone being used within the testicle to stimulate the production of sperm. Sometimes, though, hormones are going to travel through the bloodstream and act on different tissues in the body. For example, we can have a hormone from the pituitary gland travel through the bloodstream and act on the adrenal cortex. Some broad categories of hormones include prostaglandins and pheromones, and then our lipid or steroid-based hormones, and then our protein-based hormones. A prostaglandin is a special kind of lipid-based hormone. This hormone is going to be based on fatty acid action. So if we think back to Chapter 2, in Chapter 2, we talked about fatty acids. And all fatty acids are going to have a carboxylic acid group on one end and then a long hydrocarbon tail. Sometimes there's a double bonded carbon in that hydrocarbon tail. That would be an unsaturated fatty acid. Other times it's all single bonds between the carbons. That would be a saturated fatty acid. A prostaglandin is a special kind of fatty acid that acts as a chemical messenger in the body. A pheromone, generally speaking, is going to be a chemical messenger that will influence the behavior of another individual. Whether or not human beings have pheromones is still up for debate. Other organisms absolutely do have pheromones. For example, here in the state of Minnesota, we have a problem with sea lampreys invading rivers and streams from the Great Lakes system. And many of those sea lampreys will be attracted to the male sea lampreys will be attracted to pheromones that the females release into the waterway. And we've been able to artificially synthesize that pheromone and then use that to attract the male sea lampreys to a pre-designated spot for them to be trapped and killed to help minimize the impact of that invasive species. We also have the peptide-based hormones that I had mentioned. Peptide-based hormones are also known as protein-based hormones. Generally speaking, these peptide or protein-based hormones are going to be able to be easily dissolved in the bloodstream. They're water-soluble hormones. And because they're water-soluble, they have a hard time making their way through the plasma membrane in our bodies. And instead, they bind to a receptor on the surface of the cell membrane or on the surface of the plasma membrane and then work through secondary messengers inside of the cell. The two most common of which is cyclic AMP and then also calcium ions. Those are the two most common secondary messengers that work inside of our cells. So those protein or peptide-based hormones can't make it through the cell membrane. On the other hand, steroid-based hormones, since they are lipid-based, they can dissolve right through the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane and start to act directly inside the cell. They can also dissolve directly through the double lipid or the double membrane envelope around the nucleus. Steroid-based hormones are going to turn genes on and off. So these steroid-based hormones are going to have very profound effects on our body. The three classic steroid-based hormones are cortisol, estrogen, and testosterone. Three hormones that have profound effects on humans. So here in this figure, we can see a chemical signal, a hormone, traveling from the bloodstream through the interstitial fluid and binding to a surface receptor on a cell membrane. And then that surface receptor takes the signal and translates it to the inside of the cell, and we start to produce a secondary messenger. In this figure, the secondary messenger is cyclic adenosine monophosphate. To make cyclic AMP, we use up an ATP molecule, and then that secondary messenger, the cyclic AMP, is then going to relay that information to the inside of the cell. There'll be many other side chemical reactions inside of the cell. Based on the fact that we can see that glycogen is being broken down into glucose to leave the cell, I can know, just based off of this chemical reaction in the lower right-hand corner, that this mysterious peptide-based hormone is glucagon, shown on this screen. And then we have steroid-based hormones. These steroid-based hormones can go directly through the plasma membrane and directly through the nuclear membrane, and then they can activate genes or deactivate genes within our genome. So they can turn genes on or off, and then we can start producing messenger RNA molecules. We can transcribe messenger RNA and then translate the messenger RNA to make new proteins. So as these steroid-based hormones turn genes on and off in our bodies, that causes us to make new proteins or stop making a protein we're currently making with that cell. Any questions about our peptide versus steroid-based hormones? Well, let's move on to our major glands of the endocrine system. And actually, I pulled up the wrong PowerPoint. Let me pull up the correct PowerPoint for us here. I want the instructor version, because it's time for a concept check question. So, class, concept check. What kind of hormone acts primarily through secondary messengers? Would it be pheromones, prostaglandins, protein, or steroid-based hormones? What do you think, Allison?
I think that it's hard for me to even remember my name right now.
Oh, fair enough. So what hormone type relies on those secondary messengers, such as cyclic AMP? Peptide-based hormones. Well done, Angel. So C is the correct answer. Let's move on to those major glands of the endocrine system. These are the same glands that I listed off on the first figure of our PowerPoint. So we have the hypothalamus, posterior, anterior pituitary, and then we also have the pineal gland. So 1, 2, 3, and 11 are all part of the diencephalon in the central nervous system that we talked about last week. We have the thyroid gland and the parathyroids, which are directly around the trachea, directly inferior to the larynx. Then we have the adrenal glands, which is the adrenal cortex, adrenal medulla. We have the pancreas next to the stomach. We have the gonads, and gonad is a generic term for sex gland.
It actually means something.
It actually means something.
Kind of funny.
So when we use the term gonad, for males, the gonad is the testicle, and then the female gonad is the ovary. And then we have that thymus and pineal gland, which we'll talk about kind of as an afterthought. So first, let's talk about the hypothalamus. As its name implies, hypo meaning below, the hypothalamus is located directly below the thalamus in the brain. Our hypothalamus is generally going to be referred to as an interface between the nervous system and the endocrine system. It's a twofer, so to speak. So our hypothalamus can directly sample the bloodstream. Can anyone remember some of the functions of the hypothalamus? Actually, never mind. They're listed lower on the slide. So as we talked about when we talked about the central nervous system, our hypothalamus helps to regulate body temperature. It helps to regulate thirst or water balance. You could think of the hypothalamus as the body's thermostat. Our hypothalamus will regulate heart rate, and our hypothalamus also will regulate other glandular secretions in our bodies as well. Our hypothalamus can respond to estrogen and other gonadotropins, or other sex hormones. So let's take a moment and pause and talk about menopause and hot flashes. Why on earth is a hot flash so common for a woman that's going through menopause? The primary reason for that is that woman that's going through menopause has fluctuating gonadotropin levels, so fluctuating estrogen and testosterone levels in her body that she's never been exposed to before. And the hypothalamus that responds to those hormone levels isn't adjusted to those fluctuations yet. And as a side effect, the body's thermostat is off kilter for a little bit, and the woman has a hot flash. Our hypothalamus is directly above the pituitary gland. And our pituitary gland is that gland that we talked about in lab that looks kind of like a scrotum. It has two sections to it, two big bulges to it. There's the bulge in front and the bulge in back. The bulge in back is known as the posterior pituitary gland, and the posterior pituitary is the boring half of the pituitary gland. There aren't as many hormones associated with it. Something I need to emphasize for you is that the posterior pituitary gland stores the hormones. These hormones that are stored in our posterior pituitary are going to be made in the hypothalamus and then sent to the posterior pituitary and stored. The two primary hormones I want to focus on are anti-diuretic hormone, ADH. Another term for anti-diuretic hormone that you'll oftentimes see is vasopressin. And let me get the door here. That vacuum cleaner is distracting me majorly right now. The other hormone is oxytocin. Oxytocin is oftentimes referred to as the love hormone because it's the hormone that is released during orgasm in both males and females. And it's also a hormone that's associated with just general smooth muscle contraction, particularly smooth muscle of the mammary glands and smooth muscle tissue of the uterus. So if we look at oxytocin, it causes uterine contractions during childbirth, and it causes a woman that is lactating to have milk let down during the nursing process. Our anterior pituitary gland is much more exciting. Instead of just storing and releasing two hormones, we are going to have the hypothalamus send hormones to the anterior pituitary gland, and then the anterior pituitary gland is going to start making different hormones in response to the signals the hypothalamus sends it. If we look at those hormones produced by the pituitary gland, they are much more in number. We have thyroid-stimulating hormone. As its name implies, thyroid-stimulating hormone will stimulate the thyroid gland to make thyroid hormones. We also have ACTH. This hormone is kind of a mouthful, but we're going to spend some time talking about the names so that you can actually know what the hormone does. These names for the hormones will tell you what the hormones do if you look at the root words in the names. So ACTH stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. The first word I want to highlight is adreno. What organ in the body would be related to that prefix adreno? We've mentioned it twice so far in this presentation. They're directly superior to the kidneys, or on top of the kidneys. They are the adrenal glands. So this prefix adreno tells us this hormone goes or acts on the adrenal glands. Specifically, what part of the adrenal gland? Does it act on the adrenal medulla or the adrenal cortex? Allison. I almost called you Alyssa. Sorry about that. If you had to guess, would it act on the adrenal cortex or the adrenal medulla?
The cortex.
Definitely the cortex. So it goes to the adrenal gland. It acts on the cortex. And here's a term we haven't talked about yet, tropic. Tropic is a suffix that means that it causes the gland to grow and release hormones. So this right here would means that this hormone causes the adrenal cortex to release other hormones. So ACTH is a hormone that travels to the adrenal cortex and causes the adrenal cortex to make other hormones for the human body. The hormone in particular that I want to highlight for you is cortisol. This is a steroid hormone that's associated with stressful situations in the human body. And then we have those gonadotropins. The gonadotropins are hormones that go to the gonads and make the gonads make other hormones. Other hormones of the anterior pituitary include prolactin. The root word here in prolactin is lact, for milk. Think of lactation. Prolactin stimulates the mammary glands to lactate or start producing milk. A common misconception that students have is that they assume that prolactin causes the mammary glands to express milk. It's the oxytocin that causes milk to be released from the mammary glands. Prolactin causes milk to be produced by the mammary glands. We also have MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. Think all the way back to the integumentary system, like a month and a half ago. When we covered the integumentary system, we talked about melanocytes. Melanocytes are the cells in our skin that secrete pigment. They give us color to our skin. So if we have more MSH in our bodies, that MSH, that melanocyte stimulating hormone, will cause us to develop a tan. So this is a way that we can artificially induce a very natural looking tan in the human body by injecting MSH into the bloodstream. We also have growth hormone. Every once in a while, you'll see this abbreviated as HGH. And if you see the abbreviation for HGH, the first H stands for human growth hormone. And that's because, for clinical purposes, we used to harvest growth hormone from horses and pigs and then inject it into human beings. We typically don't do that anymore. Typically, it's produced through recombinant bacteria. But you still occasionally will see the HGH floating around. As the name growth hormone implies, this hormone causes us to grow. In particular, it promotes growth of the skeleton and growth of the muscular tissue. So, those are the hormones of the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. Yowza, that's a lot of hormones. We covered 6 hormones for the anterior pituitary, and then we covered 2 hormones for the posterior pituitary. Those 2 hormones of the posterior pituitary are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The oxytocin causes uterine contractions and causes milk letdown. Antidiuretic hormone causes us to not urinate. It's an antidiuretic. If somebody's struggling with bedwetting, for example, their urologist may prescribe an antidiuretic, or ADH, pill that they could take right before they go to bed to make them less likely to wet the bed. Now, I would be remiss. I believe I shared this anecdote during the nervous system recordings, but I should also emphasize that alcohol inhibits ADH production. Alcohol makes it so that we can't produce the correct amount of ADH in our bodies. So if somebody is drinking alcohol, particularly ethanol, they don't make as much ADH that they need, and they start to urinate much more frequently than they would normally otherwise. And that frequent urination, that artificially increased urination, causes them to become artificially dehydrated. They become excessively dehydrated. And many times the next day, after spending 6 to 8 hours with being excessively dehydrated, they wake up with a terrible headache.
Breaking a seal.
Breaking a seal?
Your first time you go to the bathroom after your drink is breaking a seal.
Oh, okay. You could tell I didn't spend much time in those environments.
That was my first time.
There are some diseases related to our pituitary gland. They can include pituitary dwarfism, gigantism, acromegaly. If we look at pituitary dwarfism, that's going to be a disease that's associated with not enough growth hormone. And if they don't have enough growth hormone while the individual is going through their years of growing taller, they won't have that opportunity later on in life, and they end up being abnormally short. That is known as pituitary dwarfism. There are multiple forms of dwarfism. Pituitary dwarfism is one of the multiple forms. We also have gigantism. That's the opposite of pituitary dwarfism. During pituitary dwarfism, there's too little growth hormone. During gigantism, there's too much growth hormone during the childhood years when you're capable of growing taller. Particularly before the epiphyseal plates fuse or before the growth plates fuse. Individuals that suffer from gigantism, generally speaking, have poor health. The human heart is not designed to pump blood over such drastic elevation change. If you are 8 feet tall, your heart has to work really, really hard to pump blood so far up against gravity. And the joints in your body take a lot of damage because, generally speaking, if you're 8 feet tall, you are going to weigh over 400 pounds. That's very common for individuals that have gigantism. So they have accelerated arthritis of their joints as well. Now let's say you have a tumor of the pituitary gland develop, but this tumor develops after your growth plates or epiphyseal plates have fused in your bodies. In those situations, you're still going to have accelerated growth of the skeletal tissue and accelerated growth of the muscular tissue. But you can't grow taller anymore because the growth plates have fused. Instead, bones can grow wider. There can be more appositional growth. So those individuals that have too much growth hormone as an adult will suffer from a condition known as acromegaly. And those individuals will have a very large facial features. Their nose will be very well overgrown. Their ears will be overgrown. They'll have a very prominent brow ridge. They'll have large hands and large feet. And that's associated with too much growth hormone as an adult after the growth plates or epiphyseal plates have fused. Here is the shortest man in the world as of 2013, standing next to the tallest man in the world as of 2014. This individual had pituitary dwarfism. This individual has gigantism. So human beings are capable of having a very wide fluctuation in height. This individual on the left is less than 3 feet tall. This gentleman is greater than 8 feet tall. To look at some of the symptoms of acromegaly, if you look at the individual's hands, and they have big hands. You know what they say about big hands? You have big feet. And generally speaking, that means that they had too much growth hormone as an adult, if they have overdeveloped hands and overdeveloped feet. They also are going to have enlarged noses, enlarged ears, and more emphasized brow line, and a more emphasized cheek and chins. So there'll be a thickening of the bones of the face. They'll have very prominent facial features. So, class, concept check. If you saw a patient who was slightly above average of height, they had a very well-developed bone structure, they had large ears, large hands, what condition may this patient have? Would they have potentially have pituitary dwarfism, gigantism, cretinism, or acromegaly? We have a D. Does anybody else agree with D? Yes, we have a consensus. And that is correct. D is the correct answer, acromegaly. And I am going to stop this recording right